Yeah.
Yeah, clarification. So is it going to just tell you like this is good or bad for utility, or is it going to tell you specifically?
Yeah, I'll give you like
seven you have?
Yeah, minus like 35 by 5 or something, right? Cool. Really good, because I think for the vast majority of instances that you can use this like in terms of immediate sort of like I don't know, primal like things. From the time of conception, people just generally have an understanding of like, I don't know, just like immediate sort of pain. Things that are like probably hard to communicate, probably entrenches the harm period at a much earlier stage, right? What this world probably looks like is everyone has like a little pocket watch or something. And I think it's effectively useful for a lot of things. So like, I don't know, you can immediately quantify these sorts of harms. Why do I think this is really, really good? One, I think the way in which you're going to like, I don't know, like treat someone medically, for example, means that you can actively like see the way in which they're like responding to a lot of things, right? So when these sorts of things are like hard to quantify, when there's like discrimination in terms of like you have to actively like you just don't have epistemic access to like how the other person is perceiving like the pain that they're experiencing, or you disagree with like or you just don't understand the way that they're communicating because they scream like ow, but like there's like levels of ow, you know, like or when I'm asking a fucking patient like in the fucking Toronto General Hospital like, oh, can you describe your pain, and they're spending like 20 minutes fucking trying to explain it to me, and I'm just like, okay, but like rated on a scale of 1 to 10, and people have really confusing like perceptions of it. We think that this is probably the vast majority of instances where this is probably used, right? Like, and genuinely, I have no clue how you can measure anything else with this. Yeah.
Yeah, so like this doesn't reduce the decision-making process, because you probably have to ask it, hey, should I do the incision here? Should I do the incision there? Should I then proceed with this treatment, right? An infinite number of possible options.
Okay, so yeah, but it just increases the data that you have available. So at the point at which I do an incision, I know the effect that it has and the amount of pain it's causing, and then I can like, I don't know, see the amount, or if I give like a fruit to someone, for example, and I see like their immediate reaction, which is just, oh wow, this guy gave me a fruit, plus 10 happiness, I can weigh the fucking cost benefit. So I know like, oh, this thing is like giving this person an apple versus an orange is like this much more better for them, and that's why I'm going to make that fucking decision. I think the end like impact that anyone can reach at this debate is literally just like informed decision making. At that point, people will just make slightly more informed decisions on our side, and that's probably really fucking good, right? Like, and genuinely, like, I just want to characterize how fucking useless this is for like everything else in this debate. like, I don't know, the Infoslide is literally between the activation and the action. So at that point, like, you can't measure like, I don't know, the way that an economic system or like an economic policy is like effectively harming someone, right? But I think the immediate ability to quantify these sorts of things means that the access that I have like to a certain degree of information means that a lot of the biases that people have like to people like to other groups probably like eliminate at a much earlier point in history are probably very easy to like distinguish, right? Because I know that the other person is experiencing negative 10 pain, and I can't like demoralize or delegitimize that pain because it is a number that exists and is factualized in history. It is a number that no one can fucking disprove. So I know that this person is a human, which means that at any point in history, like a claim that this like that dehumanizes someone, a claim that fucking like delegitimizes entire identities can never fucking exist, because this is a fucking device that is telling me that that claim cannot fucking be true because I am seeing the pain. But two, for fucking animals, I can also quantify this fucking pain. So when I'm like eating a fucking animal, I know the negative pain that it's experiencing. I know the fucking positive happiness that I get is probably not as good as the negative pain it's getting. And people can lobby off of these things, right? Like, it is so fucking clear. Like, for a social movement to have this number and just be like, we are experiencing negative like 5,000 like from whatever the fuck you just told me, so whatever the fuck you just did, like, and I'm just like, bro, like, fuck, that's negative 5,000 plus my like 10 gain from this joke is not worth it.
Most people who don't eat animals or do eat animals probably know that it's harmful. They just don't care.
Yeah, but now I can be like, you are hurting this animal, fucking negative million much. Sure, this debate exists on the margins, but the margins are slightly fucking better. Like, that's all we're proving. Like, there's not much else to say here. Okay, cool. Numbers are just good because quantifying something is probably the best way to operationalize something. It's the most interactive information. It is the best sort of data that you have available. It's the most convincing thing that anyone can fucking like engage with, right? I think at that point, a base level of information that we get is very, very effective. I think at that point, you are just slightly more conscious as an individual. The amount of information that you have moving forward in life is just slightly better. You can't discriminate to the same extent because you can't make notions such as like, I don't know, like darker skinned people experience like less pain in fucking like medical treatments, or you can't make these sorts of assumptions because you know the exact amount of pain that they experience. I think on those metrics in and of themselves, people just act in ways that are much more aware. I think what this looks like is just significantly greater collaborative efforts throughout like human history. Like notice that this is retroactive, right? So at the point at which you can literally see the like way that I'm treating someone, and like this is like pre-borders, like fucking like, and like just using our imagination here. I think like at a significantly earlier period in history, people realized that a lot of like conflict, a lot of actions just aren't worth it. I think there's a much greater incentive on our side of the house to collaborate with someone because positive fucking fit utility for everyone just feels so good. I love watching numbers go up, and I love fucking looking at these stocks and just going like, yes, right? Like, and that feeling of gratification is just so fucking good. Like on our side, people are just motivated to like number boost, right? I fucking love numbers. Let's fucking go, right? Like I genuinely think this is a huge motivating factor in a lot of people's lives. I think that for that very reason, people act with better brains. Very, very proud to propose.
Speaker for those remarks. Invite leader of the opposition to give an address, speaking 7 minutes. Here.
Okay, oh God, we got a bunch of cats, so I gotta do a thank you. First of all, thank you to my partner, Alex. I couldn't have done this without him. Thank you for the carry. It's really fun to debate with you again. Since our high school days, we've been running it back. Second, thank you to Hard House, all the members for your support, getting us through all the out rounds, and now we're here. Thank you to the tournament organizers for hosting a great tournament. It was a blast to be again done again. Oh, sorry, Ottawa IB, this new extension name. I hope you can win. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 points of setup, and then a lot of framing about why societal effects don't matter, and the debate is actually about the individual level. First point of setup, this is retrospective, and we know this because this is the only way the motion makes sense, right? You have to activate the button after the action occurs, so the amount of measurement is between the time of the action and the point at which you activate the button. Otherwise, like, I don't understand what the other conception is. But secondarily, I want to point out the first systematic problem here and why this is actually really, really bad, right? Because the way you're likely to calculate this is you have to quantify well-being on some sort of objective metric. The only possible objective metric by which you can quantify this has to be biological. So it looks like how many neurons are activated, or how much dopamine or serotonin I get as a result of an action, right? Or how much, like, I don't know, sad chemicals I get as a result of it. The inherent problem with this, firstly, trivially, is that quantification obviously affects people differently on a biological level. That is to say, because there are biological differences that are unchangeable, some people are propensed to more amounts of happiness and more sensitive to this amount of happiness, and some people are propensed to less amounts of happiness. So even if any of the benefits of OG are true, this systematically disadvantages people because the way in which we calculate happiness necessarily is asymmetric. If I feel less joy than Alex for breaking and making finals again, too bad for me. I guess my feelings of happiness just hold less weight in this sort of moral calculus. If I punch someone, but I'm a sadist and I get much more happiness biologically from punching that person in terms of pain, then that's also really, really unfair and asymmetric. This in and of itself is really, really bad because it means that there's an asymmetry. There's not an egalitarian form of evaluation of morality that this system promotes, and that in and of itself must be addressed by government. The framing about why societal effects don't matter. Here I'm going to engage with opening government. They say it's like, you can do things like realize that if you're eating animals, this hurts them. Like, as I think Carl points out, it's kind of obvious, right? Everyone knows that these things are really, really bad. I think the fact that we have really, really strong movements like veganism and effective altruism in the status quo probably shows that people do recognize these things. The problem is it doesn't overcome the systematic incentives for people from the meat industry, for example, from farmers who are like farming chickens and selling these chickens for money, for like the perpetuation of the meat industry to continue. So this is not a tipping point on their side of the house. Even if people are more aware that this harms like some amount of suffering to animals or humans, it doesn't change the societal structures that are inbuilt within society. The same analysis here applies to social movement. Even if you're aware that, for example, women are being mistreated or like queer people are being like harmed to a very significant degree, it doesn't actually get solvency because you can't overcome the institutional like patriarchy or the institutional systems of elitism that benefit from the perpetuation of these sorts of injustices. Because you cannot overcome, you do not have the capacity to get more funding or more lobbying over governments and overcome these institutional lobbies. Their version of solvency is very idealistic and does not based within reality on their side of the house. Therefore, this debate has to occur on the individual level. The way for why this occurs on the individual level is because individuals are far less asymmetric in their ability to restrict or coerce people in making certain actions. So I am not the government, so I do not have infinite power to coerce someone to do something, even if the Eye of Rah says it's going to lead to more amounts of moral harm. Why is this really, really bad under their side of the house? Firstly, I think this makes people become toxically more self-critical. There's a strong societal incentive for everyone to adopt this and use it. It is normalized. This means there's a stigmatization if you constantly are making mistakes, doing actions that leads to a negative moral outcome under their side of the house. This is heavily stigmatized. I think there's greater amounts of sensitivity that both you and other people have to smaller mess-ups and therefore become much more critical of themselves and others. This means even if you say something that is accidentally hurtful to someone, or you make an action that you might unintentionally realize is really hurtful and leads the other person to drive a lot more negative utility, that's really bad. The end impact here is that people become more perfectionist now that they have a much more live update of every single action they're doing, why this is harming them, and even if it's only slight, like -5 utils, it's really hard for someone to visualize how bad or how good that is. So obviously people are going to become much more averse to any sort of action that is going to lead to some amount of negative utility, but as a result, this is going to harm themselves because it means they are far more perfectionist, far more sensitive to any sort of action that they do. Obviously, this is really bad because perfectionism oftentimes paralyzes you. It makes them far more unproductive and unhealthy in the ways in which they process their own actions. If you make a small screw up in your relationship, for example, you are much more sensitive to that, harsher on yourself to try to correct that, even if it was not a big deal. But your partner or the people that you're interacting with, your friends or your family, also become a lot more critical of yourself for those small amounts of harm that you incur.
Well, I've spent many nights up just thinking about what I said and whether that hurt someone's feelings or not. At least now my pocket watch can let me go to sleep because I get an objective answer.
No, but obviously, okay, sure, you get an objective answer. First of all, I explain why it's not objective. It's obviously asymmetric because there are biological differences in the ways in which people ascribe the amount of happiness or utility. But two, you are still going to be very hard on yourself. And when you have access to information, you're likely to be much more hard on yourself. This weighs on you the entire rest of your, or the entire next few days. Second point about why people sacrifice themselves more, especially the more vulnerable people. I want to weigh this because we already explained why people who have lower propensity for happiness, i.e. their sensitivity of utility is much lower, are going to feel more devalued. They're far more likely to care about helping other people, even at the significant sacrifice of themselves, because as long as the net utilitarian outcome is positive, this is clearly a good moral outcome. So this means, one, you're struggling to benefit yourself, because at the point at which you always do things for others, you necessarily have to make trade-offs on your own well-being, your own physical happiness, your own time and effort and emotional resources that you're able to devote. You always spend all of your time helping other people study, right? Or giving debate coaching to other people in the club, but not improving on yourself. This obviously really fucking sucks for you as an individual because you're not able to advance and grow as an individual. You also oftentimes will base your happiness and fulfillment on other people because as long as other people are becoming happier and happier, you're increasing the amount of net utility you're able to attain. That is really bad for you individual. But secondarily, just on a sense of self, right? At the point at which all of your actions are now contingent on whether the moral calculus is you make other people happier, everything in your life is predicated on other people's happiness, right? It's about improving your community and things like that. This might be good in terms of creating some amount of purpose and fulfillment, but it's ultimately a very toxic narrative of fulfillment because you are not actually getting any sort of self-identity, right? You're never able to actually understand how you're going to be able to improve your own life, to actually celebrate the achievements or milestones that you're able to gain. It's always about other people. Ultimately, we think it's good to be a bit selfish sometimes. Finally, on guilt, because I don't think you're likely to get constructive feedback. At the point at which it's a net calculation, you lose the nuance about whether there is some slight amount of increases of positive or negative utility because you only see the final sum. Even if there are some positive that you might have done towards someone else, for example, within a relationship, at the point in which you see, oh shoot, me, this in the total course of this
relationship with a net neutral loss for both people within the relationship means you feel a much stronger sense of internal guilt. You feel like you're a failure, you feel like you're a terrible partner, you feel like when you've lost the friendship that you've incurred a significant amount of harm onto other people. This hurts your self-esteem, it hurts you from making meaningful relationships into the future. Humans are inherently complex, and every single continued interaction is always going to have some amount of positive, some amount of negative. You cannot distill this down to a net sum. At the point at which you have a net sum, there's loss of nuance, and you feel deep senses of internal guilt and shame. You're paralyzed individual.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I invite the deputy to address the exceeding 7 minutes here.
Let's continue the announcements if your voice is too tired. I just want to offer. Dawn,
Panel, one of the biggest tragedies of the world that we live in today is that we think much too little of the effects that our actions have on others. In a world with this useless little device, kids are likely trained to understand the direct effects of some of the most basic and visceral harms that you do. It's a tool that helps you develop as you grow up, with the understanding that you have the capacity to do good and bad in your lifetime, that your actions sometimes have direct consequences, that the pain that others feel is real. All of the problems that they illustrate, it's obvious that it's subjective, but the fact that it's biological just means that people understand the sorts of analyses that they make in their speeches, that we operationalize things a little bit more, that we recognize that the machine is maybe subjective and wonky in many different ways, but help us evaluate the kinds of most basic types of pain and good that we inflict. We think this is something that is incredibly valuable to help people evaluate things much, much more. I'm going to talk about three things in my speech. First, how this helps people understand and reflect on consequences of their actions, like Namai tells you. Second, on solving inconsistencies that make up greater systems. And third, on peace of mind. I mean, sure.
Yeah, just so we're really clear for back half. How this works, right, is you say, hey, if I run this crazy extension, will the world be more or less filled with utility? And then I'm told. Right?
I don't think that's the case, because listen, the Infoslide says the eye considers only the time period between its activation number 1, and the action in question number 2. So you press activate, you punch Namai. After your punch is done, it stops tracking. So you only feel the impact that that punch had on Namai while you were making the action of the punch. We're sorry, this is how the motion was written. It's unfair to interpret it any other way. That's what the panel intended. So let's talk about the first point, which is that it helps people understand and why don't people do good currently? I think it's because they don't really see the effects of basic actions, the most visceral ones that come naturally to human. Under this system where you can pull out a little pocket watch and see the benefits, things are quantified in a much better way, and you can actually experience things. But that being said, we understand that it's subjective. For example, benefits are going to be quantified much more vaguely. That is to say, you can't anticipate most non-instantly gratifying things. If you give someone an apple, the machine will have stopped calculating by the time they take a bite because your action has ended. If you give someone a life-changing compliment, it might not have sunk it in by the time you finish that action. So the utility is less than it actually is. This just means that people will realize it can't be used in all cases because these inconsistencies are very obvious. You soon realize that it can't consider future impacts. The impact of the punch stops after the action is done. Rather, it just shows people the fact that harm exists and that we consider the actions that we take on others. We think this is something that entrenches the harm principle, or the idea that we should avoid doing harm to other people. A lot of people in the status quo fall into a little bit of solipsism sometimes. We're inclined to think that nothing matters other than ourselves, and for that reason, it's okay to act purely in our own self-interest. I think if you're taught from a young age, if you can see from a young age that everything that you do has a good or a bad impact on somebody else, that varies to a huge degree, and that you have control over the effects that you have on the lives of the people next to you, that's something incredibly valuable. OVO tells us that people don't have the power to overcome institutional lobbies, that no one can ever make change, nothing ever changes, guy. This is just not true. We think everything that happens in the world is a collective collective action problem. That is to say, the very first time that you participate in killing an animal, you now become aware of it. That means you as a consumer are less likely to purchase these things in the future because you understand that you have an action to play there. If you say an insult to someone and you realize that something that really hurts, and you understand that your actions actually have impact on the lives of others, that means you're more likely to more deeply consider these things going forward and more deeply evaluate. Crucially, we think this evolves into building systems that are held up by the idea that people have the ability to make meaningful changes on the lives of others. That looks like a system where there is more social support. That looks like a system where people want to avoid creating harm to as many people as possible because they know that there is something out there, maybe it's God, maybe it's Ra in this case, like calculating the effects of their actions, even if this little device that we have at the moment is inconsistent and not like fallible and still fallible. Next on pain measurement and all the systems that we can affect, right? Recognize there's things like lots of discrimination in the medical space, stereotypes on how different people experience pain, misunderstandings about the effects of chronic illness and the different actions that you can have. All of these effects that are things that are like ununderstandable to someone who is not the person experiencing it are now solved because you can have some way to communicate, to convey that pain to others and to understand the harm that you're doing to others or that others feel. This is something that's incredibly valuable for building up solidarity and collective support, and you cannot get that without this useful. Second, pain in animals, right? It's about a lot of the small effects that make up the big system. Is sheep shearing good or bad? When you drop a goldfish in a tank, that increases or decreases the utility of that animal and of the world as a whole, right? These small things constitute big institutional changes that can, if we identify them from the very beginning of time, have minimized a lot of the pain that a lot of animals currently do suffer in the real world. Things like factory farming, things like how you raise the livestock, how you take care of each individual one. We're more inclined to think of them as individuals and care about these lives that have been so unjustly oppressed in the present. Furthermore, in veterinary school, you understand what is there. If I touch the rabbit on its leg, is it hurting? Is there a problem there? This is incredibly valuable for conditions that we can't diagnose yet. That is to say, even things like humans, obviously, but I'm thinking of like lizards, fish, like all of the animals that are really hard to operate on, right? This can revolutionize that industry and actually make things better because of these simple connections of pain that people cannot grasp because we are not related to each other, that this little tool solves for us. No thanks. Lastly, we think people get a lot of peace of mind, and this is in 5 parts. The first is that at least now you can know the effects of your actions, so you don't have to go to sleep every day thinking about whether or not you are, like doing something bad to someone, whether or not you should continue to be friends with someone, whether or not you should distance yourselves. It's also good to care less about your individual happiness. We think individualism is very, very bad. Most people should feel more guilt because that feel. And it's incredibly harmful when people only do things for their self-interest, where they say, oh, everyone in this world is selfish. No one cares about the impact that they have on others. We are all self-motivated. That's how we got systems like capitalism to begin with. And that's why we have a lot of the blocks on things that collectively lift us up, things like welfare systems, things like donating, things like effective altruism, all of those kinds of things. So we think it's incredibly important that people decenter themselves, that people recognize the harm that they cause, that people feel that kind of guilt and think about the effect that their actions have, because that also means people are looking out for you. It means you're considering the overall utility on the world, not just on other people. It means that you have a community to rely on when times are hard, and it means that you can now feel more confident that when you are a good person, you can receive those benefits back. It stops all the collective action that prevent us from achieving those social goals. We think this is something that is incredibly critical and actually does end up bringing people a lot of peace of mind in the long term when you think of the institutions that could have been built up by the principle that we should care about doing the least amount of harm to others. For these reasons, and because we care about animals, really.
Speaker, for those remarks, I invite the deputy to the opposition to give an address, not exceeding 7 minutes.
Okay, quickly, thanks to David. We debated a lot in high school. This is the first tournament since then. It's like 3rd year, so yeah. Thanks for the debate. It was low. I just looked at the Eye of Rah and my thank you speech decreased the net happiness in this room. I'm so sorry, everyone. Okay, the first is that society cannot change. And so the structural changes that you need to get on government to feel better are impossible for individuals because you're shackled into a system where you have to give thank you speeches. The second, though, is that individuals then feel worse because all of their activities are measured and they're told that they were bad. So they feel guilty and they feel pressure to be people pleasing rather than prioritizing themselves, which actually increases utility on net though. The reason why this is true is because opening government says right on the top that you can't measure complex systems. So we cannot answer questions on difficult things, which means we're unable to change these systems in general. These are complex systems with many moving parts, so an individual cannot make decisions to change how things work overall. Even if I do not meat continues to be produced. The second, though, is that people already know that these are harmful things, but they choose to do so anyways because they enjoy it and they want to do these things, not just like eating a burger or something. And finally, though, a lot of the issues and societal things can even be framed as sacrifice if people are actually looking at the Eye of Rah. So it's like, oh, was our government good? And it's like, no. But it's like, it's a short-term harm for a long-term benefit. And we think that they're building towards something better in the long run. We can continue to justify the current existence of things. So systems cannot change. And I do not think government proved that this little device is going to be able to change society into a utopia with perfect utilitarian good. Reputation to the case. The first thing they say is that it makes you become a better person. There's a few reasons why this is not true. The first is that the numbers lie are highly unpredictable. Many things can have many effects in ways that you can't tell because it doesn't tell you why the effect or the number that the resulting was. Maybe it's because like a butterfly saw what you did and it was like deeply insulted and suffered a lot. But we don't think that should change your action. Another thing is it might tell you to do things like just take drugs because when you check, it's like that was really good. Keep doing that. The second issue is that people become highly presumptive because like I'll be talking to someone like I'll hit on someone and be like, "Kat, did I do a good job?" I'll just look at the number and it's like, yeah, rather than looking at them and asking me how I was actually doing. People over rely on past results rather than actually asking for feedback on things. This in a scientific way could be harmful, such as like NASA researchers building a rocket. They're like, "Oh, did it work last time? Yeah, run it back." That's obviously harmful, right? What happens then is that you invalidate suffering. The comparative that opposition can take instead is to look at subjective things and listen to people's opinions. Ask them what happened. You can ask individuals, how did that feel? Oh, that shit hurt a lot. Trust. I think that's good enough. There's not much delta in terms of these like medical things. As technology improves, it just doesn't make too much of a difference. I think it's better that you actually look at people for feedback because there's biological differences in terms of how much suffering you experience. It's very hard to measure or see if this is actually correct. The final issue, though, is that people and we, in general, we should have values beyond utilitarianism. We value things like equality or progress. Imagine there's like 5 people who need organs and a fresh guy walks in and they're like, damn, should we do this guy? And they do it. And they're like, good job, humans. Everyone is happier now, right? But this obviously isn't good and we don't think this drives the human values. So the Eye of Rah leads us down the wrong path because they think that we are led into a utopia of perfection, but all we're doing is blindly following the Eye of Rah into some like zombified version of humanity with no like intelligence, no independent behavior, no individualism or personality. I think that people in general are much worse. It might look like slavery, for example, because it increases net good. And like that's probably not a good thing that we should support that.
Yeah, so surely this operational exclusion is understood in terms of its limits. So if I tell you that I'm happy or that something makes me happy, people know that that isn't guaranteed to be the long-term case as well, like in status quo.
I don't understand. I think you should trust people. Rebuilding that, just a lot of things. I don't think much of what David says gets engaged with, but let's add a bunch of new context here. I think firstly is that when you make an action now, oftentimes you'd feel a lot of gratification for the effort and work that you put in and the intention. So when you try to do something good, but now what happens instead is all that gets ignored because the number pops up, -50. Man, I tried my best, but now I feel horrible because it's saying that I did a bad job. I think you feel a lot less gratification and are less incentivized to be good on government side of the house. The second though is that regret increases because now it's like going about, am I the asshole? And everyone's like, yeah, you're the asshole. You really fucked that last relationship up. So that's really your fault then. And I think you feel worse because of this. Even if it has a good result, I think you doubt it because this number doesn't tell you why what you did was good or if you actually had the right thing. Maybe you got lucky and it was correct. Maybe someone else saw this or like a butterfly saw it and they're like, wow, great job, right? Because it doesn't explain, I think there's always doubt in the value of the number if you don't actually feel good for this thing. The final thing is though, many decisions are irreversible because this is purely retrospective, such as like a career path decision in terms of, I don't know, working at a rich job for effective altruism or like volunteering, for example, but you can't take this decision back. So once it actually happens, you're like, oh shoot, I made the wrong choice. And then you just feel really bad, even when you have the right intentions, which we think is bad. general happiness decreases then, because now you see that everything that you do is wrong. A bit of a big case here. Let's say I'm like stepping on grass and it's just like, oh no, mine is 5,000. Really sad. And like, I think that everything that we kind of do as humans may be kind of harmful in some way or another. And so on net, these numbers are going to be kind of blowing. We're going to feel really bad as a species because it'll be like, oh, I'm taking notes on my computer. Is this good? Like, no, the energy use of this like showed thousands of ants. I'm like, I don't know. Probably a bad thing. So we think it's better that you're satisfied and happy and live in a blissful state of ignorance and opposition rather than being depressed all the time, considering we already explained to you that systems cannot change. I'll take a point for back half if you have. No, front half.
Okay, so if something makes you feel, like, if everything is just so bad, then why would people use it? Like,
Oh, okay. Well, people use it for the reason they say. They're like, I love seeing numbers. People have social media, they love seeing likes and all these things. If there's a hockey watch, like, I want to actually be like seeing this, for example, right? And obviously people they're always self-critical and always doubting their own decisions. And when you have something as accessible as this, they're gonna be wanting to check like whether they did was actually good or not. But this obviously leads to massive harm because you get less gratification. Instead of looking for enjoyable human feedback, you're always looking at what does the watch, or presumably a watch, tell me, and you look at these numbers. Your life becomes not about the people that you make happy, but about the total sum of scores. You have a spreadsheet at home that sees your total score as if life is a video game, and it becomes much less satisfying. You get evaluated constantly. You look at your result and you see what's actually a good decision, and did this actually make life better? I think very clearly then, opposition proves to you that the world is much worse because you feel much shittier as a person, you feel much more guilt, and you become sadder. The second thing we talk about though is about people pleasing. I think that then people shift their behavior in ways to try to help others. And this kind of sounds like a good thing, but not at the point when it becomes extreme. To the point where you're sacrificing everything you do just to help other people to increase this number. I don't think this is actually beneficial. There's a lot of ways, and I think in general, people make the lives of other people better, or we're all trying our best to do so as a society, as a civilization in general. And I think that this is good enough and should be prioritized rather than the incredibly like demotivating numbers that you see, or like trying to pursue this at the cost of your own like well-being and stuff like this then. Just a little bit more rebuilding on why like society cannot change, I think. Like yeah, as we already explained, these numbers already tell you that like, you know, like problems exist, society has a lot of issues. We don't think you can structurally do much about this. Leaders, as David explains to you, will still be leaders and still like control people, manipulate people, and use them in other ways and justify their actions, perhaps using this by saying like, oh, look, the numbers are up. But in fact, this is a horrible society for the planet or for people in general then. Very clearly then, how to oppose.
I thank the speaker for those remarks, and I hope they catch their bus. To give an address, not exceeding 7 minutes here.
This. That's my flow.
just take it, that's fine. Go in the trash at this point.
Well, I couldn't find one and I don't have more float around. Okay, she did. No, she did something. Some quick shout outs in order. Thank you, XA, for inviting me to come speak at this tournament with you. This has been a really awesome experience. Thanks, Ottawa, for hosting this really awesome tournament. This gives me great confidence in when you host Worlds in 2 years. I think it's going to be a really awesome tournament, and I really look forward to it. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Hard House. Thanks QSID. This is my first time year really coming to QSID tournaments and engaging with all of y'all on a deeper level. And I don't know, Canadian circuit is really awesome, and I wish I started coming earlier. You guys were. I'm going to start my speech by minutes. OG does 3 things that kind of tick me. The first thing is they claim that they're going to help simplify the motion and then give me a mild aneurysm when they try to. Right? Let's just make some things very clear. you aren't gonna use this on actions, like you're not gonna activate it and then do the action, right? Because like, how can there be utility between you activating and then you haven't done the fucking action yet? So this is, I think O's right, I wish they were here so they could validate themselves, right? But like, this is done retrospectively. You do it on actions that have happened in the past. That, yeah, thank you, Nick. Like, this is how we should be creative. Thank you. Okay, this makes sense to everyone. You do it on retrospective actions, you do it on actions that happened in the past, you can see the utility. The second thing is they have a really tiny scope that I also think isn't really in the debate, right? Like, for the reasons I just said, you're not really going to use this on decisions that you make in the now, right? For a couple of reasons, two main ones. The first is because it's like there's just no time to calculate the utility. But the second thing is like, note that all these small decisions you make in the now, we really think about like, how does this affect the world? We don't give a shit, right? I'm thinking about myself. I'm thinking about what makes myself feel good. I'm being a monkey. It's unclear as to why this is the most likely use case when we care about these things, right? The third complaint I have about OG is that I don't think their benefits are very well met, right? I think the first thing, they contradict themselves. If you look at a lot of their like benefits, it seems to rely on future predictive decision making, which obviously is not within the scope of the motion. But I also think they're very vulnerable to the op response, which is like, just don't fucking care. What if you're an asshole and you don't care if it decreases utility? We're going to show you why we get solvency. First thing I want to talk about is how we change the decision-making process. And I want to make an observation. This idea that we, try and calculate the total utility of what we do, like this is the status quo in many regards. Like this is something that we do quite often when I'm trying to decide which charity to donate to, when I'm trying to decide, how my actions affect the world. Is, weighing against my own interests, whether I should, I should come TD a tournament to try to give back to the community, or I should just like stay home and study for exams, right? Like, and here's the thing: it's like over time though, you realize something is that like it's actually really hard to figure out what the overall effect of your actions is. The only thing that you really know is like, how did it affect me? And I'll tell you how it affected me. I got a 51 on my midterm because I TD'd HHIV, and that's something that's gonna stick with me forever. And so over time, you bias towards selfish interest because that's the only thing you're truly certain of, right? So here what this, like the ultimate product of this, right, is that you have a society, all of us, right? I'm gonna accuse every single one of you guys in this room. They're all kind of selfish. They're all a little too tribalistic, right? And then we prioritize ourselves in our decision making as a consequence of the way that we grow up. It's a consequence of lacking any kind of objective or good way of calculating the effect of our actions. Now, I want you to reimagine if you grew up with the Eye of Rah. And every time you wondered how have my actions affected the world, how have other people's actions affected the world. Every time you, instead of deferring to some weird, complicated moral philosophy, you could get an objective answer. It would change the way that you think about the world. Because now instead of having some disconnected, muddy path towards people's impacts on the world, you have a straightforward answer. It brings a much more tangible connection between you and the effects that you have on the world, on the way that other people affect the world. It makes it real to your mind. It makes it embedded in the way that you live, in the way that you see decisions, the way that doesn't happen right now. We think that's really awesome. And we think it's much larger in scope and probably what the CA is intended rather than the very tiny, tiny scope that we get out of opening government. Cool. Sure, PY.
Yeah, so this has to be intentional, right? You have to activate. That's the keyword of the motion. So this only applies to intentional actions you decided to do. You can't just do it retroactively on things that you do.
No, it just says action. You can apply it to actions that have happened. So you can we spent a long time reading the Infoslide. Please, guys, you guys check the Infoslide, right? It says you can apply it to an action that has happened, and then you can calculate the utility. So if this is any action, it doesn't have to just be your own actions that you've inherited, right? Okay, moving on, right? So I think the idea from off is like, okay, well, you can get the total utility of the eating the animal, and it's negative infinity, but you don't fucking care because it's delicious, right? Now, that's probably true if we gave someone the Eye of Rah now. I'd probably be like, I'm still gonna keep eating meat. I don't really care. But imagine if I had the Eye of Rah from my birth, right? Imagine if I had the Eye of Rah ever since I started making these decisions, it'd probably be a lot different. Okay, second extension then, I want to talk about institutional change, right? Why do you get much better decisions being made? Three things. Firstly, institutions are still fundamentally made of people. So we can talk about system level mechanisms, but it's important to consider that like just the individual calculus of like the people in charge, they do have a lot of power. And if all these people fundamentally care more about general society, then that's something that they're going to instill in the decision. The second thing is it prevents harmful policy rollbacks. So a lot of the reasons why you get harmful policy rollbacks, like Trump rolling back a lot of the Obama era policies that were like pretty unanimously helpful, is people are misinformed about whether they were actually helpful. Yes, part of them is selfish, yes, part of it is ideological, but the reason why they can justify those things is because they also believe, oh, these things have broadly been harmful, that these things broadly have been a terrible mistake and they should have never happened. If you, again, you have an objective answer as to like, no, these things were actually really good and created tons of positive utility. And again, that's something you value more because it's something you grew up incorporating into part of your decisions. Right? It means that it's a way harder to justify being like, oh yeah, but I still don't really like it because he seems kind of socialist, therefore I'm going to justify these rollbacks. This applies to people in government, this applies to people on the ground voting for Trump, this applies at all levels. We think it's going to prevent a lot of the harms that are happening in the status quo. The last thing here is that it elevates the kinds of analysis that you can do. You can do a lot more micro incremental analysis about whether something created good or harm, right? Like if you have microfinancing, increasing the amount by $10 or $20 or increasing the interest rate by a couple percent, you can see how those decisions in the past have then created differing amounts of utility, allows you to make far more calculated accurate decisions about what truly maximizes the most utility. This just expands our efficacy and how we can create good for the world. I think that's really, really good. Overall, it means that we get massive impacts because even small decisions from institutions are magnified through the large number of people that they end up affecting. We think this is the biggest impact of it. Last extension on better moral systems. You get a valid criticism from Owen who dished us, which is that, oh, utilitarianism is like kind of wrong, not true. And I don't know, I defend utilitarianism more. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan. But I do think there's something really interesting about this motion. Is like, yeah, maybe pure utilitarianism, these criticisms apply. But that utility and thinking about utility is actually part of every single moral system, right? Even if you're a virtue ethicist, you still care about things like utility because it affects what you think is virtuous or not. Even when you I don't know, Kant was fucking off a rocker, so I'm not going to talk about Kant, right? But like utility is part of our decisions, even if it is not the end all be all of our decision. So now when you have information on utility, if you have information on the effects of eating meat or you have information on the utility of an abortion, those are things that influence your moral thinking in a way that's positive because it makes you more informed in the way they interact with other moral systems. You don't force everyone into a pure utilitarian bubble, but you do give them a lot more access to choose on how they want to value that instead of automatically deferring to other systems because there is no real way in this world to calculate utility, right? Who says that, but maybe people should be more selfish? First question, like, should they? I don't know. I think people in general skew towards selfish, and I think it'd be good if we were all a little bit more helpful towards other people instead of ourselves. The second thing is, like, who does this affect? I think the people who are most likely to not be selfish enough are actually harmed on their side of the house because they never know exactly how much they're helping, and they're likely to err on the side of caution. Overall, we create the biggest impacts in this space. We change the way that people fundamentally think about the world.
I thank the speaker for those remarks. I invite the proposition to give an address, not exceeding 7 minutes.
This all the business, yeah. Okay, cool. Before I begin, I know it's been a relatively humorous debate. I'm going to mention some things that are not so humorous. So just a trigger warning for anyone involved. I'm going to talk about things related to disability, self-harm, things like that, because I think they are relevant to this debate. So just, if you need, I'll give everyone a second. I'll do my thank yous while I allow people if they need to talk thanks for everyone to be part of the journey. It's been really great moving to a new city, to have a new community that I can just immediately throw myself into. You've all been fantastic. Yeah, it's been great, especially obviously the MDU, but also all the other clubs have been super opening and welcome, and obviously my long-term double partner for making everything great, moving to a new city with me. So yeah. So I will assume now if anyone needed to opt out, had sufficient time, and I know people have things to catch, so let's get rolling. Okay, I'll begin with what I think is probably, and I don't want this whole thing to be just who's read the motion certain ways. I'm going to tell you a couple ways I think it can be interpreted. I think they largely result in a similar thing. But first of all, just the word activation seems to imply, at least in my mind, that at some point you have to make a decision to start recording some action, unless the implication is it is the activation of the existence of the device. We're told by OG that that's probably the beginning of time. OO wants to talk about children, so presumably something like you're born with or whatever kind of thing. So to some extent, I think there is some kind of, on those implications, it's extremely unclear that if you're saying, hey, when I broke up with my ex, was that net good or bad? If that's tracking it all the way back to the beginning of time, I think that's a bit unclear. I think what's probably far more likely in this debate is to some degree you have to have some conception of, and I think probably what it's intended for is like, I want to know if this charitable giving is good. I want to know if setting the interest rate is here. I click it, I then do the thing, and then I go check on the thing. Importantly here, this requires cognitive action. And I want to note that this is really important. This is a mechanism that's going to impact all of O's impact that they miss. This uniquely skews in bad ways, which is to say people who do not care will not activate it. Listen, a racist doesn't need to know what impact their slurs have. They just never click the button in the first place. I'm pretty sure people who genocide other people know they've harmed them, but they're certainly not going to find out exactly what number. Alternatively, people with hypercompulsion and things like that and anxiety are certainly going to use it far more often because they're constantly worried about it. Note that this is then a preference thing, is the people who are going to be most negatively impacted use it, and the people who would actually be changed won't. Like, right, people who eat beef, it's not because they don't know, it's because they don't want to know, and they are never going to click this button to find out. I also noticed on a small note, like on like a utility monster thing, there's probably some cases in which maybe you do enjoy that shrimp enough that that single shrimp isn't worth it or whatever. So you could actually have some genuine things where you could have concerning behaviors where people still use it towards their advantage. And I would also note, like, you can't address climate change with this thing, right? Probably it is more net utility in this moment for you to drive your car to work and not freeze or take public transit, but it's probably net harmful for the planet after the recording of that action. So there's a bunch of instances where I'm really unclear that it results in all the beneficial ways that they tell you. Okay. I'm going to paint a picture, and again, this is where the trigger warning comes in, okay? I want you to imagine that you are a profoundly disabled person. You have feared your entire life that you are a burden on your family and your parents. One day, the morbid curiosity overtakes you and you click the button and you ask yourself at the end of the week, was I a net utility on the lives of my parents? And unfortunately, it comes out saying you were not, because they probably had to work overtime. They probably worried about you. You probably live in any of the number of countries, which is a vast majority of them, where there are insufficient supports. I want to note that this will make this person incredibly depressed. This person is likely to consider thoughts of suicide, if not act on them. These are the types of people who are affected in this motion. Importantly, the people who are not impacted in the motion are the people who do the most harm, because they will never click this. Again, it requires some degree of forethought. I'll tell you right now, most people who do terrible things often do it because they didn't think about it. And those who do terrible things and think about it don't want to know the exact number of harm. Like, no school shooter is concerned about the exact number of utility they cause. They're still going to do that horrific action for whatever reason they believe. It's important then that the decision to activate this device does not cut down equally. It does not accurately measure different things. What it uniquely does, it is tailored towards the people who are most likely to activate it and feel harm from it. Those are the people who are constantly worried about their family, constantly worried about their action, and their lives are probably made worse off because of this thing. The people who we presumably want to change their mind, something, I said this in a PY off the beginning, people's moral action isn't a problem of knowledge, it is a problem of lack of motivation. And it is entirely unclear from the government teams, and this is their main burden, to explain why this access to knowledge translates into more motivation. And insofar as you obviously have a massive incentive just not to get this information, you are probably unlikely to do so and unwilling to opt in, trying not to opt into the system. Now, obviously the response here is other people will do it for you, right? You can ask questions on other people's behalf. Cool. You know what's the only thing worse than checking the machine yourself to see if you're in that harm to your family? Is when the bully at school does it for you and asks you in front of it and the all-present device activates it. I want to note a couple of things that we differentiate from our own. First of all, we actually explain why. Because what front half is genuine, I know we've used this a lot in debate, but front half is genuinely a wash. Because obviously there are some instances in which people would do this for good, and there's some instances where there's bad, and they never tell you which is more. I uniquely give you the mechanism that tells you that the preference and the fact that you need to, at some degree, want to know about these things and record it naturally sways that the people who do the most harm will not activate it, and the people most harmed by it will. That means that overall this is probably likely to be bad. On this thing, I'm sorry, this will become the way you determine the world. The main problem with utilitarianism is it's hard to calculate. Its main problem is now gone. This idea that it is a thing and found in other philosophies, I'm sorry, it's just wrong. I'll run through the big four with you. Virtue ethics, not at all. It's about balance between different things and which virtues increase your thing. Utility doesn't play into that. Second one is utility, absolutely not. It's which duties you have a right not to violate. And finally, contractarianism is about whether or not you would consent to this. None of those have utility. It's unclear. This will obviously obviously become the dominating thing. And it's not OO's like biology thing, like come on, we're probably like a dualist mind perspective, which all that means is it's probably some more complicated aspect than just biology. What I think it most likely looks like is preference satisfaction. I'm going to explain why that's again uniquely bad. Front half if they have one.
This is you're prescribed with. It's socially conditioned in groups and preventable since you grow up checking the eyes.
Yeah, so I think your mom probably makes you check the eye to see if like you not cleaning your room is bad for it. I don't think your racist mom has you check the eye to see if you calling the kid the N-word is bad for it, because they probably condition you against that behavior. Like it's extremely unclear. Again, a vast majority of harmful moral actions do not come from a lack of information, they come from a lack of care, and it's unclear a thing. And I want to note that they need to explain why they're willing to trade off the people that I've mentioned, which are not an insignificant group. And if we want to talk about social dynamics at larger level, you can ask the system, hey, would it be better if the Tutsis were alive or not, and things like that, right? There are horrifying implications to these types of things that importantly, they need to explain why we should trade off these people who will be put in tangibly worse positions in order to access some information. It's, again, why is having access to the information likely to spark the meaningful changes that honestly can't just be found from any basic empathy, which is to say the chicken that runs from you when you kill it probably doesn't like to be killed. The people who you call slurs and cry and put in concentration camps probably didn't like that. None of this is explained why it is a problem of information. But uniquely, once this exists in the world, there's no getting away from the actual like, horrifying implication that some people's lives are net utility, max, minimized.
Speaking for those remarks, I now invite the government to come and address not exceeding 7 minutes. Here, here.
Thanks, RB, for speaking with me. It's been a delight. Thanks for Ottawa for hosting and everyone for making it happen. And thank you for the judges for staying this late and helping decide this outcome. Thanks to Dane for dragging me here. I had a good time overall. And thanks to the CAs for this delightful motion, which I found easy to understand. The example that Carl raised was very profoundly touching, but also speaks to problematic biases that this device can help to correct. I don't know why. There's an assumption that when you click this button, the person will just be told that their existence is a net harm on the world. Because people who are profoundly disabled still experience things. They eat food, they have thoughts that can in of themselves create happiness. The process of being alive and feeling the wind on your skin creates joy. But also, love isn't really tied to the extent to which people need to put time into you, money into you. The fact that you raise this child, even if they're different from other children, growing up, feeling like your life has had this like enormous positive difference to another person, which can be, by the way, more fulfilling and more happiness creating than if you had like another child who does not have like health conditions, because you believe that you have done more to make this person grow and shine, for example. I think that that is the change that we're able to create on our side of the house, that is to create light. Three main responses to the main thing that fucks, to the only thing really that they have an actual harm on. One, I think the assumption again that they have is really problematic and probably untrue in the vast majority of instances. But number two, I also think that the overall quantity of like well-being is usually, the individual is usually outweighed by the change to the person who is in their life. Because for the latter, for the parents, for example, no thanks, I'll take you at 5, have a lot of like fluctuations. Their well-being is expected to be other things as well. And it's like momentary shifts in emotion and mood, for example, where like well-being is much more fundamental thing that the individual person influences to hard set. But the final thing here is like, I'll just bite the bullet here. If someone is profoundly miserable, if they're terminally ill, for example, and they're in agonizing pain all the time, and they generally feel like life is not worth living, I see no reason to force them to sit through more of this and endure, because we don't understand that this life, the experience that they have is different to ours, and they would prefer not to be experiencing those things. So I think that those instances, the worst case scenario that they bring up, I don't think that this is a tragedy and we have to bite the bullet. Then on the other material Carl brings, which is really just mitigation in the same lines as overall. He's just bitching about how, but like, what if we misinterpret the data in this way? Or what if I just believe this like wholesale and went ahead and did this incredibly idiotic thing? Like, my main observation here is this fundamentally is still mitigation, where you say in some instances, we aren't able to fully correct for mistakes that people organically make. Like the hateful bigots that they identify. Like, yeah, sure, maybe they'll go like the research like critical race theory and use this device to track well-being of that, but would they have fucking done that otherwise? Oh, obviously not as well. There is a large intersection in the middle of people who aren't just like, who aren't evil, but who are ignorant or who are changed by biases and don't see that the impacts of their harm is creating to them. I think OG brings this argument to us to their credit, though I will say the impact is maybe slightly double by the fact they themselves keep saying that it's very marginal. But I think also it takes us all through and explains why the subset of people who have these conscious biases is so large, why then we have more positive change. But I will then say that, shifting to our extension on why it's so winning, that I don't really understand other teams' fixation on individual action. I don't think it's the biggest passion around, because the market isn't very large, right? Like, let's say OG's own examples where they're like, well, when you're a kid, you are shown the device and you're like, I now understand right and wrong. Like, kids, you know, numbers, maybe they don't know the thing. But like, what's much more visceral is like punching like a child in the playground, seeing them cry, having your mother sit you down and be like, do you understand what you just did and what that pain is? I think that that's why the capacity to change individual behavior and help them understand the concept of pain and suffering and connection to individuals maybe already exists to some extent on our side. I agree with OG, there's definitely a margin here, but I question the extent to which it shifts everybody en masse. Where this debate really comes into play, and here is where, unfortunately, other people are constrained by limitations of imagination and limitations of reading comprehension. But this debate is really about evaluating actions in general. And the question then is, where is that information sorely needed? It's often things where there is a lot of uncertainty, moving pieces, where you don't know whether a geopolitical event maybe had more harm, maybe had more good, because there was just a lot of harm that could have otherwise happened. Maybe it's like a scientific, it's like a research project, or like a policy where there are benefits and there are harms, and this entire process is about weighing those harms against each other. That's the thing that, there's a whole industry, like the fucking entire thing of consulting is like trying to figure this shit out, and like we're not very good at it because we're entirely reliant on retrospective data. The crucial whole, if we don't have access to all the data in the world, we're inevitably to be missing things, and it's freaking trial by error every single time. This device fixes it because the motion says you accounted for every single piece of well-being in the world, which means you can say with certainty that the rollback of X policy caused harm, or that we already know that this policy exists, has over the course of its existence created enormous amounts of good. That's the point at which you don't have the problem like flipping and flopping, which then defunds like huge government projects that could have helped people but didn't. The benefit of this, I think, is pretty easy to imagine, affects millions of people across the globe, and crucially is used in conjunction with other scientific methods we already have, but which are imperfect. CO.
For claiming that the majority or even all the people are net utility driven, but inevitably some of them will be for a period of time, and it only has to happen once to cause the profound despair.
I agree. The thing is though, that they have this weird like the conception of how to use this device where like use it one time and like never again. I really think that you have this device like the whole time, right? Like you use it once, use it again, use it again. Like you see that there's a wide diversity of different outcomes. And like this is like a trivial mitigation perhaps, but I really think that this does minimize how dramatically harmful some of their impacts are, number one. Number two, makes our impacts more robust because you collect information over a course of period of time. And then you can track change over time and trends as well, which helps you understand really closely and changes that you should make to actions. But the final thing here is again weighing. This is tragic, but you can't take the experiences of one minority group, say this is really, really bad, and run with that, because I could just spend the rest of my speech going into the tragedies every single day that could have been prevented, but aren't. And I think that the point of this debate then is about weighing the quantities of people who we help. The final thing I want to observe here is that Carl's pushback to our piece and analysis about how this helps with moral calculation is just listing out 4 different types of philosophy as though we don't know it and saying, oh, this doesn't apply. I'll give you a clear example of where it plays in: abortion. This is a fundamental principle of calculation for a lot of people, but it is hung to some extent on an understanding of well-being. Because if I, on a personal level, knew that aborting the fetus would be the loss of a life and would have a significant harm in terms of well-being across that period of time, and if that information was widely acknowledged, that would change my own behavior and it would help me become a more moral person and avoid the kind of situation they have on their side. Panel, I implore you, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has the potential to change humanity, vote CG.
Thank the speaker for those remarks. I invite the opposition to give an address, exceeding 7 minutes to close off this tournament. Here. Okay. You know who? Andy, you.
We still do shout outs in debate, right? So because this is being recorded, I'd like to give a couple of shout outs to my people in Ghana, the Ghanaian Debate Society, University of Ghana, and the Kwame Nkrumah University Science and Technology. I'm sure they will all be happy and proud that I'm here right now. I want to give a big shout out to Carol. He's a beast. And then shout out to McGill Debate Union, because apart from courses I do, McGill is like, the debate union is like my second home. So yeah. Okay, 3, 2, 1. If closing government had any great opportunity of carrying to these debates, my advice to them would have been a very constructive engagement of what Carol brought you. We don't get constructive engagement of what Carol brought you. They do not touch it as well as they should have. They give us a flippy-floppy analysis of what Carol brought you, and I'm going to show you why we win on our side of the house. We think that on the basics, on the 4 houses, the best interpretation of this debate, or the best way you can judge this debate, was brought to you by Carol in this debate. But what do we get from the government whip, especially? So the government whip tells us about disability and engages with Carol's disability argument by saying, well, there is a net investment that has been put in you over time. We doubt this is highly going to be something that will be detrimental to a disabled person. Then Carol asks you in its POI, which is very important. You always go back to this app. The app can tell you you're a fantastic human being to the universe. All it takes is one time. All it takes is a momentary time whereby you see your mom suffering. Your mom has been exceptional to you. Not every disabled person is as tough or as a big son of a bitch like I am. Some people have a lower tolerance level or a lower acceptance level. And the likelihood, if there is a likelihood that just one person can act on this, we believe that is a net harm which we think was not engaged on their side of the house. But for the sake of pettiness, I'm going to take everything we get from side CG. So side CG has this fetish for the fact that they think this app is going to change policy and the way people vote and stuff like that. But this is why that is wrong. Because we say, even in the interim, there are scientific researches, there are policies and researches about people who evaluate policies, about the impact of policy. However, politicians take decisions irrespective of the fact that there are these scientific researchers or not. People do not give a fuck. You see, sorry to anybody who is a Trump supporter, I'm very sorry. But people who know the detrimental actions of this man who's been accused of assaulting women and stuff like that, people still vote regardless. It doesn't matter what this app is going to tell you that this person has a net impact to the universe or not. People will still vote regardless. And I think that is something that is very crucial in this debate. And then also, they tell you about the fact that this the information will give you utility influences and your access to choose. But you realize that in government member speech, he gave you an example of charity and how even in our life, people make decisions and people are able to have access to this. They don't show you how access to this information and the conclusiveness of this information is mutually exclusive to their side. We think that even on a normal, people have an ability to make this. So this big case, which is a little bit drenching from OG about changing policy and about solvency, we think solvency does not right in this debate because Carol gave you a very good, I'm not a good mechanism guy, that's why I'm always coming second. But Carol gave you a good mechanism about how all these things about solvency do not exist on their side of the house. And then let's take OG, a very interesting group of people in today's debate. But essentially, what we get from OG are, all this make people better. You get empathy, you get guilt. First thing about empathy is Carol shows you again in his great make that people who are stone cold hearted people are the ones you would most likely want to change on your side of the house. And the reason is these people are not going to use it. Let's say, for example, if in an act of self-defense or say in a revenge action, someone has done something to a relative of mine and I go kill the person, I do not think going back to check this up about how much did my enemy feel when I tortured him is going to do much great. In fact, it's going to give me a hand for how much they suffer. It doesn't change anything on that side of the house. Everything empathy, guilt, and those things do not exist. But most generally, we have told you that all the harms they give you on their side of the house, the people you impact are this weak-minded people, people who cannot act on things. But before I continue, save your case, Ochi.
Okay, for your own analysis, if I'm a burden on my parents' life, why the fuck would I care about this if people generally see that they are burdens?
You see, this is the thing, no, this is the thing about humanity. If you are a burden on your parents' life, the thing is, people have self-conscious or people have things they think about within themselves. So there might be a burden on their parents' life and they know that they are a burden. But then they go to this your app to seek the validation to justify that they indeed are a burden. So indeed they are going to act on it as compared to a world where they are unsure as to whether they are a burden to their parents or not. We think that is what your app does on your side of the house. And most importantly, another thing we get from their side of the house is that this makes people generally better and all of that. My response to that is we have all been, a bunch of people have been in relationships we knew we were the bad guys. We think that the ability on you stop looking in the skies, you knew you were a bad guy in that relationship. The thing is that the thing that happens with this is that you do not want to dwell on this regret which they sell to you. Humanity has the ability. The reason why we've all been able to heal from any bad thing we've done in life is that we've been able to move on from this regret. We've been able to become better people out of it. When we've shown you that the kind of people who you want to change on your side of the house, I'm not going to use this app, I'm not going to feel this regret, then nothing happens on your side of the house. But then there's a concept of people who even still regret doing something. Oh, will I do it again? Hell yeah, I will do it again. There are these kind of people who exist on your side of the house. So the solvency you tend to want to create in today's debate will not happen. And that's why I think we read on Theo. But why did we read on Theo? We think even on the up bench, we bring you better clarification in this debate. You have to credit Carol's argument when he tells you that. They say the people who use this are people who are in need of change, people who need to have empathy, people who need to feel guilt, people who need to be better people. We tell you that those people are not likely to do it because these people are very cognitive of their actions they took in the first place. But then Carol second gives you this argument about the fact that if you do not even use it, your police might use it for you. Your police might use it to pressure you. So, for example, in the Rwanda genocide, the Hutus and Tutsis, how the Tutsis were going to use the app to say, how does it feel genociding this amount of people? That's something you should credit, but that is generally a bad thing. It's something people already know. But then we tell you that the only reason people do not change is not because they don't know that killing an animal is bad, but it's because they think eating meat feels good or tastes good, and that is not in any way going to change the way they make their decisions or make their actions. And it's for this reason we've been able to prove to you exclusively from our side of the house that there are net harms. Probably sexy.